welcome to the Christmas 2025 panel discussion of the Terra Researcher and HG Researcher series. Our topic of discussion today is just what the F. I'll let you fill in the blank what the F means. Just what the F is SoTL. And joining me is obviously my co-host John from HG University. But more importantly, we've got 5 amazing panelists joining us today. So in no particular order, I'm going to introduce them according to how I see them in that order on my screen. We've got Professor Jackie Potter, Dean of Academic Innovation at the University of Chester. Hello, Jackie.
Hi, Ian.
We have Dr. Catherine Hubber, Director of Learning Enhancement and Academic Practice from Buckinghamshire University. Catherine's also my boss, so everybody say good words only about me, please. Hi, Catherine, you all right?
Yeah, fine. Nice to see everybody.
We have Professor Simon Thompson, Professor of Hybrid Learning and Director of Flexible Learning at the University of Manchester. Hello, Simon.
Sorry, I meant to speak. This feels like it's a little bit like University Challenge, where they go around all the candidates and they go
and jury service selection.
All that.
And we have Professor Don Irving Bell, Head of Scholarship and Teaching and Learning at Alden University. Hello, Don. How you doing? And last but absolutely not least, we've got Dr. Nigel Francis, Senior Advisor, Pedagogy and Practice at Buckinghamshire University. Nigel's in the same team as myself, but he's abandoning us quite soon to Australia. Hello, Nigel.
Hi, everyone.
Right, so we will get the show on the way. So an opening warm-up question, no surprise to you. How do you personally being the emphasis, because this is not a lecture, how do you personally define SoTL? Sorry, just to take a step back. For those of you who don't know what SoTL is, that stands for Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. So how do our panelists personally define SoTL? Don, would you like to?
Yeah, I'll kick off. Thank you for inviting me as well. It's lovely to be here. So for me, it's really quite simple. It's about reflecting upon what you do, making a change in your practice, noticing the difference that change has made, and then the scholarship part is dissemination, so telling someone about what you've done. So that's how I define SoTL.
Amazing. So it's anything teaching and learning related, really, isn't it?
I was just going to add that I'd see it as activism, because it always starts with a desire or an intention to do better in the practice of your teaching and to support your students. So it's not disinterested, which is something that can be the case for other types of educational research.
I see it as a continuum more than anything, which is the very low end. You've got, if you're reflecting on your own teaching practice and then being informed on how to change and adapt that through other people's work and literature, then that is a form of SoTL, all the way through to the point at which you've got a really planned out piece of research around teaching and learning practice that will ultimately become a publication. And you don't have to do all those things, but on that continuum, you're doing some of those things. So I think that even if you're just doing a little bit of teaching and reflecting, you're at the very lower end of that continuum, because you're starting that process of thinking about really structured reflection and changing your own teaching practice, which is a form of SoTL.
Yeah, so I've put it in the chat. I really like the Kern model, which is the dimensions of activities relating to teaching. I've put the links in the chat, which Jackie, I also disagree where some of those things are put on the framework, but I really like their dimension of thinking about teaching through 2 different lenses. So there's the private to public lens, and I think for SoTL we have to be on the public facing lens. We have to be communicating that, disseminating that, externalizing that in some way, and then the systematic to informal axis as well. So sort of how rigorous we are, and there's different levels of rigor. There's a full-blown own, remote control, randomized control trial, type, serious research, top end bit, or there's, systematic use of the literature, or, action research, or whatever it is you choose to do. But I think that pushing it has to have some sort of structure or underpinning, and so I think that's quite helpful. And they position that framework, positions SoTL in that systematic and public bit. But I like that even within that, they say there's multiple things that count there. So, it's sort of getting away from that, it has to be about papers in educational journals thing, which, I know I've got a question about promotion later. Be interested to see how many of your institutions, view scholarship as publishing in educational journals as opposed to other formats. But I really like that dimension of thinking about it, because there is that continuum, but those two dimensions, I think, really help me anyway.
I don't think I'd actually have too much to add to that, other than putting it into my own words. I think it's SoTL is systematic. There's got to be a structure to it, as Simon was saying, is that continuum. I think involving students as co-creators within that is really powerful as well. So having that sort of student partnership element to SoTL really adds a lot of value to it. And the key thing is dissemination. Actually getting it out there and sharing your practice. And I think that's the big difference between a lot of academic research, where they, certainly from my discipline in STEM, where people try to keep things quite close to their chest because they want ideas to be pinched. Whereas when I moved into sort of the SoTL space, that willingness to share and to enhance practice is just really refreshing.
Yeah, and actually it really chimes with what Leonard's asked in the chat as well, which is good. So Leonard, it's like you've read our minds in terms of how we plan this. So really what distinguishes SoTL from kind of traditional educational research, and I'll just use some of Leonard's phrasing as well, there's lots of overlapping terms: pedagogical research, educational research, learning science, evidence-based learning design. Why SoTL? What framing does it offer? That kind of thing. Be really interesting to hear your thoughts on that.
I think for me, the SoTL is more about starting at the local level and having that immediate impact on your students, because you've identified something that needs changing to enhance their learning experience. And then it's disseminated, and perhaps it becomes more about pedagogical research, because it becomes a generalizability thing where you're trying to spread that and you're trying to influence practice, and it gets adopted elsewhere. But I think the thing with SoTL is it's a very personal thing to your situation at that point in time that you're doing that research. That would be, I think that for me, that's the big thing. And then the dissemination aspect of it doesn't have to be peer-reviewed papers. It can be blogs, it can be YouTube videos, it can be conference presentations, anything which is spreading that message. So that's where I see the big discrepancies.
Yeah, I've been picking up on what Nigel said there. I completely agree. So typical traditional research, can take an awfully long time to craft, and certainly, as Nigel's alluded to disseminate through a journal system, and arguably sometimes making it a little bit out of date by the time it gets published. But in contrast, scholarship is very practical. It has really tangible outcomes, and in many cases, almost instant impact. So I'd say that's the difference for me.
I think that point about artifacts is really important as well. That sense that it might not be an output that describes the research that was undertaken, but it might be a product of the work. So it has that commonality with action learning and action research. And that can be a really useful thing to consider, that the output can have value and benefit to other people who are teaching and learning with students in a similar context. And I suppose sometimes it's helpful to frame what it is by what it isn't, or what it gets criticised for. And often it gets criticised for being kind of a bit of watered down research. And Nigel mentioned generalisability, because it's so context rich. Sometimes it can be hard to say, well, how would that be of value and interest to someone else? But very often it's not just the outcome or the output from the research that's interesting to others. It's actually just having that conversation with others who are investigating and taking forward methodological approaches to investigating their own research practice.
Yeah, and I like that. And Simon's just put the Manchester definition. I really like that enhancement thing. I think there has to be a focus on actually improving and enhancing what's happening on the ground. If I think about my outputs, some of my outputs are definitely educational research, which, you know, is valuable in its own right and leads to those outputs. But can I say that those things have had an actionable impact on experiences in the classroom? No, they're in a slightly different category. So I'd put those as research rather than scholarship. Whereas I think it's that connecting that link back, isn't it, to see, you know, that enhancement where things have changed because of what you've done. Like, you know, some of the research I've done, you know, it's been really valuable and interesting, and it's got published and all the rest of it. But has anything actually changed as a result? You know, it is, you know, I think that impact and that sort of closing the loop on it, I think is really essential.
Yeah, I think the bit that I was kind of alluding to here is that if institutions have got their own definitions, you're ultimately, if you're on a particular career pathway, are going to have to align your view of scholarship to whatever the institutional view of scholarship is, because you've got to map your evidence against the criteria which they're going to assess any kind of promotion. But I don't think that entirely captures it always. But you do have to be cognizant of the fact that your own institution or the institution that you're moving to may have its own definition of scholarship that it's using as a criteria-based framework for promotion. I think that generally captures it quite nicely. You can imagine Manchester's quite a large organisation, so to get any kind of agreement on a term has taken probably 12 years to get to that point.
Just to clarify my understanding really a little bit, and maybe for colleagues on the call as well, in that way, would you kind of, careful how I do, because I know that action research can sometimes be a bit of a word that people aren't very happy with, but would you conflate the two a little bit, SoTL and action research? I know, coming from a teaching background, we were always encouraged to do action research in the classroom. Is that how you would kind of frame some similarities?
I'm happy to jump in there. I would see them very similar, John. I think depending on which definitions and how you work with your idea of SoTL, action research is about participation of your groups that are going to be influenced by the outcomes of your work. And in that regard, SoTL, with its focus on partnering with students or having genuine benefit for students, for me, could be and is a form of action research. But obviously action research can take place in many other organisational settings.
We found sometimes the colleagues get confused with SoTL versus scholarship and how they intertwine. Any thoughts from the panel? There is then the idea of being scholarly too. What does scholarly actually mean?
I think this is really interesting, and I think it's kind of, and this is a bit of a sort of neoliberal universities sort of argument, but scholarship is a very broad-based thing, and sort of everything that universities do is scholarship, right? That's the whole point of us. We are, using information, we're gathering ideas, we're creating new ideas. So the whole of a university should be adopting a scholarly based approach. But sort of more recently, we've sort of conflated scholarship with research, and now we're trying to reclaim the scholarship word, but we do so in quite a narrow way. And I think it, of kind of, SoTL's this, scholarship's this little box here, and obviously scholarship of teaching and learning, it obviously has to relate to that practice. But I think there's a really weird way that we're trying to use the language of, as all of the stuff with, reward and recognition for educators has rightly been not fully addressed, but it's much more on the agenda than it was 15 years ago. But we're kind of trying to now make scholarship a little thing, whereas it's a broad-based thing, of which peer-reviewed formal research is only one type of scholarship. So it's a bit weird, and in terms of the way that we use the language. I mean, obviously, as I say, SoTL's got to connect that practice and teaching and learning. But yeah, I think we're getting us tied in knots a little bit about this. But but as Simon says, it's also how senior leadership teams refer to these words, and I think we use the language in a very odd way. I can see people nodding, but
yeah, I was probably just going to say, I think for me, scholarly, you'd want your students to be scholarly, because that is really, I think, about how you apply yourself in kind of serious academic study, I guess, in a scholarly manner. This is the approach that you take, I think, to study and education more broadly. Whereas scholarship, and scholarship particularly of learning and teaching, or teaching and learning, whichever way you want to put it around, is about applying scholarly approaches to a specific activity, outcome or purpose. And that's how I would define it, is that scholarly is an approach that you take to lots of things within a higher education setting. Scholarship is a thing where you apply that scholarly approach to a specific thing. And in this context of teaching and learning, scholarship of teaching and learning is applying that scholarly approach to a meaningful activity or endeavour inside teaching and learning context. So there's obviously an interrelationship, but they are distinct, I think, in some ways, because being scholarly doesn't mean that you're producing you're engaged deeply in scholarship.
I think the ship word shifts it to that more external thing as well. There has to be a sort of a product or an output or an impact of some of it, whereas scholarly is perhaps more an inward directing thing, whereas scholarship positions is going back out again.
On what Catherine was saying, really, that the etymology of the word university comes from community and community of teachers and scholars. So scholars is the word. With you saying that scholarship feeds through everything we do, that actually the etymology of the word university actually comes back to the idea of scholar and scholarship.
And Jackie's comments about there's a lot of critique about the lack of a unifying definition of SoTL and the implication for this. I think that is a good segue into the next question. What are the biggest challenges then to be doing SoTL? Because it's not well defined. It's not like a proper research project where you have research questions, you have the answer. SoTL is kind of, I suppose, in my experience, a little bit more fluffy. So what's been the biggest challenges for you guys in your professional practices?
It's just with you saying fluffy, because a paper that I wrote for the Teaching and Learning Inquiry, when we were doing this collaborative autoethnography, which is, again, a little bit like scholarship of teaching and learning. It's not a real thing, is it, autoethnography? One of the people we'd spoke to had talked about SoTL and scholarship being pink, fluffy, something, so you saying fluffy then just made me think of that. So recalling my own challenges when I'm from a STEM engineering background. So as a newcomer to scholarship of teaching and learning, I think the one of the biggest challenges is perhaps the pressure from your peers to undertake proper research. Why are you heading off in this strange direction that could really impact you negatively in your career? And often that advice, it's well-meaning. And I think despite the increased number of routes that Catherine was mentioning then to academic promotion as a reward for those who follow the teaching and learning pathways, I think there are really still big misunderstandings about what SoTL is, and that goes back to the conversation we've just had about having a clear definition. So therefore, it isn't always valued as it should be. And I think consequently for a number of staff, I believe that pressure is still there, not to do it in this way and to do proper research. I think that's a big challenge for me, other people's perceptions of what it is.
I think one of the biggest challenges I've seen others have, and certainly reflects my own experience many years ago when I moved from doing research in environmental science to working with people and working with students, particularly in classrooms and doing scholarship, is the move to being methodologically sound, which is something that Peter Felton is quite clear is a principle of SoTL. But actually, when I was starting out doing these sorts of inquiries, my methodological base was very limited. So I would be choosing ways to do investigations which were really not fit for purpose for the small scale interventions I was doing. And I see that quite commonly, that there's this sort of methodology, the kind of appropriation of a method that's familiar from your discipline, rather than having the capability to select a method that might be either very interesting or generate the kind of data you might want to use. So I think that's a challenge for a lot of people wherever they are on their journey. And to be honest, it's a challenge for any researcher in any discipline. But that idea that it's not fluffy, actually, it is meant to be methodologically sound, but it is within the context, and it's context rich, and it might be small scale.
Just to pick up on what Jackie said there, I think the main challenge that I really felt was I don't have any training in doing scholarly research. I've gone through 4 years of an undergraduate degree, a PhD in my discipline, and then suddenly I'm being asked to do something that I don't feel I have a background in. Especially when we start supervising students or master's students, PhD students who are also doing scholarship, you you can feel out of your depth sometimes a little bit. And, I think that's going back to what Jackie says there. You then don't really know what the most appropriate method might be because you don't have that background in the actual discipline.
But I think for me, this is indicative of the fact that universities have separate contract arrangements for staff. So you've got some staff that are on T&R and some staff that are on T&S. And there's absolutely a tension between disciplinary research and scholarship of teaching and learning as an output, and the latter not counting as a research output within a disciplinary context particularly. I think that's partly as a result of our research funding environment. The way that research is funded is a disciplinary model. So you've got to output research outputs that of a certain level within your discipline in order to be able to get research. Education is not a real discipline. At Manchester, we have the Manchester Institute for Education. They have to produce disciplinary outputs. However, scholarship of teaching and learning is probably still not seen as valid in that context. And what we've done as an organisation is separate out the outputs from research into a T&R role and the outputs of scholarship into a T&S role. And I think there's always that tension that because of the environment that we work in, that it's not seen as real research because of the very nature of the way we're funded and the way we've now structured promotions criteria, which says you're either teaching focus with scholarship to improve that teaching, or you're teaching and you do research, which is disciplinary outputs.
I think it's absolutely fascinating the way that it's positioned in universities, because for institutions that are supposed to be all about evidence-based and new inquiry or whatever, the lack of wanting to look at what we do as our core activity in that systematic way, we're happy to study absolutely anything else, whether that's in the arts, humanities, in the sciences, whatever, anything except what we do as our core business activity. Like, I find it just like as a piece of psychology in the sector and the institution really fascinating, of like, why is our own core activity not a valid subject for rigorous inquiry? I just don't get it. But yeah, I'm kind of going back a little bit. I think in terms of that, challenges are subtle. I think, I'm sort of building on that methodology thing. I think particularly, I'm a scientist as well. And I found moving to the educational literature really challenging. Of not in terms of my own, but what is the literature basis? Like, scientists were trained to think very visually. We need tables, we need graphs, we need pictures. And the education literature is, and I've seen some of the worst graphics in my life in education related papers, or it's just all words. And I found that really difficult as a sort of transition of different ways of thinking. And the other thing I think that people haven't, sort of kind of with the recognition thing is time. If it's not valued, then workloads get squeezed. And we know that people who are on T&S contracts are often given disproportionate teaching loads. That S, in a lot of cases becomes, it becomes kind of completely squeezed, and effectively it becomes T only. So even people who are on T&S contracts are not given the time and space for that scholarship and given the support for it as well. So I think that time pressure, finding the right networks, and certainly when I started, I was the only education focused person in a very research intensive institution. No one I knew was interested in this stuff. It took me quite a long time to establish a network of support and help for this stuff, because it was quite isolating. So I think that all of those structural factors then translate into some quite practical things as well.
Just as an aside to that, we also have T only contracts. So we have got T, T&S, T&R. So that is to link through those promotion pathways, so that you know which pathway you're moving on. It's very difficult to jump, I think, from. It's almost unheard of to see somebody to move from a T&S to a T&R, but I have seen people move from T&R to T&S. But even that, sometimes it feels like there's a hierarchy there somewhere. Nobody will kind of explicitly say that, but that sometimes feels like that. And it absolutely shouldn't, because it's about parity. You're just doing different work in a different way and still benefiting the organisation. So there is that. I mean, there's always that tension between research being the valid thing and scholarship being the not valid thing, which I guess talks to Puyan's point about the fluffiness of it. but it is absolutely a legitimate area of research and study, and we have to champion that. All of us that are here, we always have to keep banging that drum to say, no, this is really valuable stuff. We should spend time doing it.
Yeah, because otherwise we end up just being boxed in by the ref rules, actually, rather, I think that owning it ourselves and this is what it is rather than this is what it isn't. Although even within ref, I find it really interesting. So, so within the physics ref submission, you can put educational focused things through physics, but you can't through in biology. So even within the ref framework itself, different disciplines have taken different attitudes to it. And, I think, we, as a sector, we need to get together actually and start to lobby if there needs to be consistent across disciplines. Is it refable? Not that I want everyone to be in the ref, but the ref itself is inconsistent as to whether these sorts of things are valued in ref, and we know how much ref shapes institutional thinking.
Just on that comment, Catherine and colleagues, there is something called the hidden ref, and I've been lobbying the hidden ref to put scholarship and pedagogic research as a category for consideration. And it is. So more about that in the new year, but we'll be writing criteria to measure the impact of SoTL and pedagogic research and running a competition in 2026 for people to put themselves forward. And the hidden ref has a direct link to the ref. So there's a lobbying possibility and potential there. But there's also a lot of competition for other people and ideas to get into the ref.
First of all, I do have a little point to make. And I'm gonna sound like I'm on a soapbox for a minute, if that's okay. But it's also to acknowledge that SoTL doesn't necessarily just take place in academic circles. It takes place in some professional staff as well, who aren't necessarily linked to progression, pay, increase and things like that. And then that kind of in a roundabout way brings me to the question that I'm going to ask, which is about institutional changes. What kind of institutional changes do you think would better support SoTL practitioners, in your opinion?
I don't mind picking this up a little bit because I think you're absolutely right, John. This is one of the great things about SoTL is I think it's open to everybody in the organisation to be able to engage in SoTL in some way, including, as we've already talked about, our students. So, and I think that is one of its real strengths, is that in terms of the stakeholders you can involve in SoTL, it is absolutely a broad brush. Anybody in the organisation can get involved in it. I think you're also really important to point out the thing that you've made is that often people in PS roles particularly are not specifically rewarded for that SoTL engagement, and that is a real challenge for the sector, is how do we kind of bring parity to that? Because Manchester's a good case in point. We've got very clear pathways for academic staff to take, to progress through a career and have SoTL as an important part of your role to carry that through from from day one that you arrive all the way through, if you want to, through to a professorship. And that's not the case for colleagues that are on PS roles, and I have been on both PS roles and academic roles, and that is a real challenge, I think, and it's a debilitating challenge for organisations where they can't offer that kind of progression for PS colleague, because ultimately they end up losing them. They go somewhere else because they want an opportunity to progress. They're really passionate about teaching, learning, and they're doing really good work, but they don't get formally recognised for that SoTL engagement, and they don't get rewarded for it. And I think it's absolutely right to call out, and it's a real challenge.
It's not just a problem for professional services staff, although it's exacerbated and more visible there. Simon Walker and Susan Smith did some work about just the definitions of SoTL being different across universities. Makes it very hard to plan productively a career around SoTL because the benchmark is always changing. But I think in terms of my own experience of doing SoTL, I've done it on a range of contract types in a range of institutions as I've moved around. And I've always just followed my gut instinct, which is, what do I want to improve? And how can I do that? And taking an inquiry-based approach and making that public. And I think if you can be led by your heart as well as by the extrinsic value of the work that may be accrued through your career, somehow your career will catch up with you and give you that possibility for success in that more extrinsic way.
I would 100% agree with that. I went into SoTL because I saw that there was something I needed to change to make something better, and it's just spiraled from there. I didn't do it because I thought it was going to lead to reward or recognition, promotion, anything like that. There was something I need to fix for my students, and I think that's about how we all fall into it. But as you gain more experience of doing it, and you learn more about how to do it well, or better, I should say, not because I still don't do it well. You gain that confidence to actually try things, and I think that's the important thing, is to just have a go.
I mean,
my only rebuttal to that, sorry, Dawn, is that
fine.
I think we're probably of a type of person that's able to do that. There's some types of people that they're able to be the salmon that swims against that stream, and they're happy to put a challenge in place because for whatever reason, there are some people absolutely do not feel like that they do want to engage in SoTL, but they don't want to be swimming against the tide of activity within their organisation, and often a challenge for it. And I think we have to recognise that the fact that it is part of a pathway defined by the organisation makes it and legitimises it much more than if it isn't. And I think for PS colleagues, it's not clear and it's not a legitimate part of their role, yet they absolutely engage in it and should be rewarded and recognised. So I take the points that, yes, absolutely, just get on and do some good things, and that will translate often into benefits. But if it is there within an organisational structure, that really does legitimise it and frees the flow of somebody to be able to do that more readily.
So, I mean, I'm sitting here quite smugly, really, in the private sector for the first time ever. I think going back to your question, John, it depends completely upon the institution. So at Arden, and where I was about 6 months ago at BPP, both are teaching intensive universities. Arden's teaching intensive and digital first is how it badges itself. BPP teaches, his motto is professionals teaching professionals, and everything we do is focused on teaching and learning. We don't have the research, we don't have in that same way, we don't have different contracts for different lecturers and tutors. Everybody is engaged in the teaching. Scholarship at Arden, this is where I've come to Arden to do this, is for everyone every day. The only pathways we have to reward scholarship are to routes to associate professor and professor are via the teaching and learning pathway, if you will. Yeah, there's disciplinary research if that's what people want to do, but the focus is mainly on, you know, people, the difference they're going to make in the classroom, and that kind of research will be supported. We've got mentorship schemes to support people through that academic promotion. We support those seeking to have their scholarship recognised, and we can capture that, and then we can use that for, you know, advanced HE fellowship awards like NTF and Kate. We've got internal awards that are all around teaching, Vice Chancellor Teaching Awards. We've got a growing number of routes to support colleagues to disseminate their practice. We've just got a scholarship fund set up, you know, so it's people can apply to that to get some money, put ideas forward to get some money to support scholarly endeavours. So everything we do at Arden is all around teaching and learning. That's a main focus. And to get any real support to do research, it has to have an impact back into the classroom. And it was very similar at BPP, but without the scholarship funding and things like that.
We got a question in the chat from Leonard about, so it sounds like basically anyone who is talking about learning and teaching and or doing teaching and learning and trying to do it well in some thoughtful way is doing SoTL.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's this difference between doing scholarly teaching and doing the scholarship of teaching and learning. So to do scholarly teaching, you don't need to talk to anyone. You can invest time and effort in reflecting on and developing your practice. But when you look at models of what the scholarship of teaching and learning has, it must have some demonstrable output that's shared with a community. That could be done through teaching or talking rather about your teaching and learning. but there needs to be some other principles like partnering with students. So it's not something where you other the students who will benefit from your work. They need to be somehow incorporated as really active participants in your research inquiry. This concept of methodologically sound is so fundamental. It really does need to have some basis in rigor, but that rigor will probably look different because sometimes these investigations are so small scale and so rich in a particular context, and they involve working so closely with your participants as co-producers or co-researchers. So I would say no, it's not the same as simply being a scholarly teacher. It does involve more intent and this public facing piece of work around your research and inquiry.
Definitely agree with that. I think that the first steps that people take towards SoTL, though, are being a scholarly teacher. I think that's the initial steps that a lot of people take because they don't know better, because they haven't come from that discipline. I think that's certainly true of me. So yeah, I agree with what you're saying, Jackie. I think that getting into SoTL can be challenging, as we've discussed, and I think being prepared to take those initial first steps, even if you don't recognise that it's the first steps towards SoTL, is important.
We've got another question in the chat. I'm just going to read it out. I'm not fully convinced by methodologically sound. I like Nigel's personal approach and John's school approach to active learning, where you just try something with your student. Is that necessarily methodologically sound? I also think if we formalize it too much, we may put some colleagues, particularly early career colleagues, off.
I think it's a really interesting comment, Paul. I think there's a bit of a balance in there. So I think, I think that, using appropriate methodologies, there is something in there. But I think I think the other piece for me is connecting to what we already know about teaching and learning. So if I think about, if I go to a conference and, talks that I would sort of mentally box in of, that's just someone just sharing their practice. So this is what I talked about, what I did, and I maybe had some student quotes to say that they quite liked doing what I was doing. Yes, there's a publicness to that, but it's not quite for me yet in that scholarly thing. Whereas those that are then, it doesn't have to be a sort of full literature review and all the rest of the thing, but starting to connect to those bigger ideas, connecting to some sort of rigorous understanding of how learning works. Most people start with Bloom's taxonomy. I think it's overrated in the sector, but most people start there, kind of thing. But kind of connecting to some of that, the sense that there is an evidence base for it. So even if you are at the very early stages in terms of your own methodology, recognizing that there is methodological rigor out there, I think is again part of the beginning of that journey. And if I think about where I started, realizing to connecting to that, it took me longer to realize that there was all of that stuff out there than I'd realized. So I think that can be part of your methodologically sound bit. Is not necessarily is it a well-designed survey, but is it connected to a coherent body of knowledge? Is part of that. But yeah, we can have a whole other conversation about why Bloom's taxonomy is so overrated in the sector, but it's where a lot of people start with their PG cap, right? So yeah.
Do you, the panel, think it's helpful for institutions to define scholarship?
I think it'd be more helpful if we could get institutions to come together and agree on a unifying definition of scholarship.
It's never going to happen though, is it?
No, I know, but we can have wishful thinking, chase the unicorn.
You could say that about anything. Blended learning is always the one that, like blended learning, hybrid learning, dual delivery, all those. I think without that, without us coming to an agreed kind of sector-wide definition, we have to have institutions defining it, because otherwise colleagues that are engaging in that work need to understand the legitimacy of it in the context of their organisation. Now, it's more important for those that might be thinking to progress career-wise against that, because it's definitely going to be a measure of something. But I think also it's useful to have a sense of what that institution perceives scholarship to be, because then it helps set the tone for the conversations that you can have within it.
How we think that SoTL can better address the overall student experience, and what are the views of our panel are on that.
Can I go back to my point about linking that to methodology. And I think it's incumbent on scholarship of teaching and learning to be bold and creative and relational as we approach inquiry and working with students. And I think we can best enable the development of our teaching practice and our student learners' experiences by working in relationship with our students when we do this SoTL activity, whatever it is. And I think that's probably one of the hardest, most contested and least discussed elements of some of the models of SoTL, that people are not participants at a distant point in time filling in surveys about their experience, the expectation that there is some form of co-production and co-working with the students who will benefit from the inquiry process. And so I think even if the inquiry doesn't lead to an improved experience because it was an intervention that was going to have a fabulous impact, the fact that we're talking to students about the fact that we're invested in doing well by them and we want their experience to be the best possible, that we're exploring with them that learning is not a fixed set of activities that everybody can learn and understand how to make work, but that it's so contextually rich. I think just having that discussion with learners, particularly in the world of, you know, higher education as a consumer good, is so important.
Yeah, so I think there's, you know, there's the sort of student experience side of it, but there's also, you know, I think we underplay the role that SoTL can have to play in some of the big questions facing you know, institutions. So, you know, we've got things like access and participation plans, like TEF. You know, again, let's not just derail with talking about TEF, but in terms of some of the, you know, the problems that institutions are dealing with, you know, in terms of student outcomes, equity of outcomes, progression, awarding gaps, all of those sorts of things. I think we're really undervaluing the role that SoTL can have to play in understanding, because some of these things are really, you know, they're sort of, you know, wicked problems. You know, what is actually driving the awarding gap? What's actually driving your non-continuation rates and all of those sorts of things? So I think there's a, you know, there's a student experience and students who are participating in that. But if we're really going to find out what is underpinning these differences in metrics, that, you know, your VC will know about those metrics because they will sit in those big strategy meetings and, you know, what's our TEF risk rating and all of those sorts of things. I think we've got an opportunity of, you know, we shouldn't be doing it to chase the metrics and, you know, just chase the TEF rating. But I think you know, in terms of understanding some of those big drivers, I think we could, you know, maybe position SoTL as, well, we need to really understand and partner and work with our students to really understand what this is about in a rigorous way that we can then design interventions that work. Like, and that is what SoTL is all about. So I think, you know, there's we often do it in a separate space, and there's a lovely separate space to be doing that. But I think in terms of that strategic institutional alignment bit, why have we got, you know, the issues that the data, you know, metrics can only tell you, you know, they can't tell you why, and SoTL can tell you why. And I think we maybe underplay that in the way that we position it.
So we're gonna go back to a question that was asked in the audience earlier, and then it ties back to the kind of the flow of the conversation as well. Obviously, we talked about defining SoTL. We talked about how it benefits student experience, our kind of promotion path. To your point, we can go into more specificity about that later on if we need to. But before all of that, before we talk about promotion, we need to show impact. Because we can't just go to our bosses and say, give me a pay rise. Because the first question you're going to ask is, show us your impact. So how do we measure impact of SoTL? It kind of goes back to the fluffiness of it. How do we make it less fluffy and make it actually, these are what I've done, and I want a professorship because of that, or whatever that might be.
There's two strands to the impact of SoTL. There's the personal and there's the institutional. So from the personal perspective, it used to be really tacit, you know, measured through your confidence, students' feedback, you know, those kind of things. But with the advent of being able to secure a DOI, when you can publish things on, what used to be the National Teaching Repository, but now Zenodo and Figshare if you have personal accounts, for teaching focused research and resources, you know, for work that would it's probably still is classed as grey literature, but it's much easier now to measure the impact of SoTL through those metrics, through the number of views and downloads. So that's one way to measure SoTL and scholarship of teaching and learning now. But the institutional level, you've got your national survey data, you've got your NSS, you've got your TEF, which offer insights into the impact of scholarship in action. And perhaps a really good example of this, which is why I can lead on this question, is the impact of SoTL at my previous institution, BPP, which I left just a few months ago. Obviously, I'm now joined this amazing team at Arden. But just for context, BPP is a bronze institution in the TEF, and I was there for 2 years. And in less than 2 years of working to embed scholarship across the business, we implemented a scholarship survey to measure the impact of it. This year, BPP came top in PTES, and it's a bronze institution. So if you want to see the impact of SoTL in practice, that's exactly what can happen when you get everybody every day working to make things better in the classroom for the students. So that they're just 2 ways.
So I'm just going to frame this from a point of view of if somebody was going through a promotions criteria at Manchester and looking at what the expectation is there. I think if you've ever done something like submit, an MTF's a good example. If you do submit for a national teacher fellow, impact is all about, you have to look at that. We reframe it around 3 things: reach, value, and impact, which again is a kind of an advanced HE approach. So you talk about the impact, which is the tangible change that you've had, and you evidence that either through qualitative or quantitative data. So you either do that through data gathering exercises that you've had, or you engage in some qualitative post-event data gathering, and you can demonstrate that it's had a demonstrable change. So at the University of Manchester, the way we do that through the progression is expecting change to have more reach. So you would expect at kind of a senior lecturer level that reach should be within the programme, within the school. Then you've got faculty and institution, and then moving up to regional, national and international impact. Now, I think scholarship of teaching and learning is very difficult to directly say this change I made on this programme did this for the NSS, for example. That is really hard to directly link the two. However, you can tangentially link it through the evidence base of qualitative responses that you can gather through senior people within your organisation, for example. If obviously you produce a research output as well, as a publication output, you can measure the citation of that, but that's not always an indication of impact. It's just an indication of popularity of that article. And so you tend to find that what we see is a mix of both with that, but alongside impact comes value. What value has that impact had? And I think this is where student voice really lends itself well to scholarship of teaching and learning. Nearly everything that we want to happen in the scholarship space is an improvement to a learning experience for somebody. And it's those learners gathering data from them in a really structured way that can really help you inform your evidence base to then put forward as impact.
I just wanted to come in because Shaylee Minochi is in the audience, and I think Shaylee or someone, a colleague of hers, has probably put up her work from the Open University with Trevor Collins, and it is so fantastic. I feel not intimidated, but I would feel kind of unsure of my footing to talk about impact. And I suppose just to add, the kind of model that we've talked about, or we often talk about, is one that's very much a kind of a Western ideal of promoting individualism through the links to promotion, through this kind of concept of citation and other people valuing what we do. And I'm back to this idea of intrinsic impact, which is, did it set out to do what I wanted, which was improve student learning? And how do I really know that? And let's not lose sight of just the philosophical good-heartedness of SoTL when we start to try and measure all the other extrinsic ways that we might get value and benefit as persons from the work we do.
Can I just ask a related question? So what we've talked about so far, a lot of this is about perhaps colleagues whose work is more focusing on directly teaching student or working with student directly. And now, John and I don't work with student directly because of the nature of our work. And a lot of our kind of digital education colleagues who are in this core, what your advice would be in terms of obviously measuring impact with SoTL? Because I think we've established that a lot of what we do can be and should be SoTL, but then if you're not working with students directly, that just makes it a little bit more indirect, because there's a layer of my learners and my colleagues, but the actual impact on the student, I have not directly influenced that, but I have. So it's always a struggle that I think a lot of us have. How do we substantiate our impact?
That's sort of almost senior fellowship style, one step away, isn't it? You're leading and influencing your colleagues who are implementing practice. So I guess you evidence it indirectly, or you evidence it through the quotes and the metrics that you get provided with by those colleagues, and measure the impact that they're having.
Yeah, absolutely, Nigel. You've got to think of it as, if you hadn't had those conversations or done that taken that action, would that event have happened? So I've just given you the example of BPP. I haven't taught a student, but it's the impact of that strategy being filtering down and filtering back up again that makes that difference. And if I was writing an NTF claim this year, I'd be putting that in. Topping PTES as a result of work that isn't just me by any shape or form, but that's the kind of link that you've got to make. And it's very difficult. That's the one thing we've not talked about, is how the characters in scholarship and teaching are really, really, everybody's lovely people, but I'll dig myself a hole here. But you know what I mean? We never shout about what we do. We just get on and do it. And we don't like to take credit. We don't like it, particularly when people tell us we're doing a really good job, or we don't go shouting about it out all of the time. And probably we should, because we do make a difference every day. And we're not vocal enough in celebrating that, I think.
Yeah, so I was just going to say, I think you're always going to have primary impact, and then there's a whole layer of secondary, whatever going on. And I think what's important, what I've learned to do, is to understand where my primary impact has been, because then I need that person to provide evidence to me that my work with them has had a secondary impact, and so on and so forth. And so we're not always we're quite often really good at doing things, but they're not often very good at gathering evidence that it's had impact and what that impact looks like. And over the years, I've actively gone about that process. And I think learning to do that is a useful thing, because you never know when it's good to have that information to hand to say, all right, so what impact have you had, whether it's for a PDR, whether it's for a conversation with somebody, or whether it's just to share an experience. And I think we also, as Dawn alluded to, the nature of our work, we always talk about the we. So we always talk about the work we do in the collective sense of the we, because that's what it feels like, and that's the reality of what that is. But you have also got to start thinking about the I. What did I contribute to that we? What did I do to make this a success? What was my role in it? And I think it's difficult for us because our nature of our work is very collegiate.
Yeah.
And when you write something like an NTF and you start talking in the I, you feel really awkward, and it's a horrible experience. And you just think, oh, I don't like this. But it's a really good process. And that process for me really helped equip me to be able to do that in a more structured manner. So I'd encourage people to start thinking, yes, this is a shared endeavour, but I played a role in this, and I should recognise my role and the benefit that it brought to that piece of work.
Yeah, to pick up on that, so the way I always encourage people I'm mentoring through the senior fellow, principal fellow, NTF is always, if I hadn't been part of that team, what would the difference be? So what did I actually contribute? And that sometimes helps them get over that mental block of me rather than we.
Oh, I like that, Catherine. Making an appointment with yourself once a month to record and review what you've done.
Yeah,
I like that.
And that appointment with yourself has to be sacrosanct. Like, no one is allowed to have. So I have it in my calendar. I have an hour and a half every month that no one is allowed to have that meeting. And even if the VC called, maybe I probably would reschedule it for the VC. But
Damien, are you listening?
but I'm really religious about it because I think there's so much, oh, I delivered that workshop or I did that training session, or, it just gets lost in that, oh, the calendar invites, but actually like, no, I have recorded that I did that. And then, I had that conversation with that subject over there. And they'll be good to go back to 6 months ago. What was the impact of that following on? Because, it just gets lost in the day to day quite a lot in this space, in a way that, because it's so linked to our practice, doesn't happen so much with research. It's easier to kind of keep track of what's happening in a research strand, but in a SoTL strand, because it merges with the day-to-dayness of the job, it's easy for really good activity to just completely get lost. And, and I've had conversations with people of like, oh, well, are you going to put that in that application? It's like, I'd even forgotten that I did that thing. But, someone else has said that was really important to me. So I think keeping that track of it was really, genuinely really good advice. Can we just talk about the sort of just intrinsic reward and satisfaction of doing SoTL as a thing for kind of self-identity,
absolutely,
self-ownership? Because I certainly find you can probably correlate how stressful my job has been with my SoTL outputs, but for me it's the other way around than you might expect it. So when the job is really stressful, I've got lots of people I'm trying to coordinate and all the rest of it, I have those days that like that's all too much, and actually what I want to do is to kind of get back into a SoTL space. If I can read this thing, or I can write this thing, or I can design that next bit, and there's a kind of happy bubble of it in terms of that kind of everything, institutions are difficult places to work with, but actually this is a really rewarding thing for me to do. So for me, my SoTL actually increases as my stress levels increase, because I almost need that retreat into that niceness and that impact of it. I don't know what other people think in terms of their sort of self-identity, self-motivation. They'd be interested to hear what the panel think.
Yeah, I think I'm at the point where, I don't know, I'm old in the teeth. I've been doing this a long time, but I did research in a discipline before I became a SoTL researcher or an educational researcher. And I just think careers are things you look back on and follow your passion and do things that make you happy. And obviously life isn't like that 5 days a week, 8 hours a day, or however long your working week is. But there's got to be something that gets you out into your workplace and happy and excited about what you do. And pretty early doors, when I started teaching students, it was actually listening to what they said about how things were going for them as learners and trying to make things improve for them. And that feedback cycle, that virtuous feedback cycle, that working with students productively and co-productively on making their experience as good as I could, was so exciting and so nice. And that was the intrinsic motivation. And it still stands today. Nowadays, the students I work with are predominantly learning consultants and members of the Students' Union. But I still have that same attitude to developing activities for staff who I see as learners in their context of developing their own teaching practice. And it's that intrinsic motivation has to be core, I think.
I was just going to say my own experience is that the scholarship component emerged out of me wanting to do better teaching, because I recognised early on in my career I wasn't a very good teacher, and I didn't want to be one of those academics that I may have experienced that really didn't seem to care about teaching, because for me it became the most important part of my role. And that obviously that's intrinsic, but also it's for me wanting to do a good thing, because I believe those people that came to my session deserved to have good teaching while they were in that session with me, and I wanted to do a better job. So that reward for me was knowing that I was doing a better job and those learners were getting a better experience. And actually, I liked them telling me that. I liked them saying, oh, I really enjoyed that session, or I totally understand that now, and you've really helped me, change my thinking on X, Y, or Z. That's a reward in itself, and that's intrinsic for me. What I did then try and do, and I suppose this is why I do talk about the promotion element of it as well, is that I did also spend a huge amount of my time getting universities to understand that you also needed some extrinsic reward mechanism to really drive this as an important thing within the organisation. So I absolutely agree, Catherine. The intrinsic motivation is probably what starts this in nearly all of us. And it's very rare that I've seen somebody just engage in scholarship just because they're looking to follow a career path and it's defined in a promotions criteria. It's nearly always to do with the fact they want to do a better job in the context of teaching and learning. And I think that's one of the things I love about the community, is it is all of us are there about making a difference to the learner experience ultimately. And I think the fact that it can be used as a promotion is a secondary benefit to nearly everyone that I've ever worked with that has been promoted through a scholarship route.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with Simon. If any of you have ever heard me talk about my light bulb moment, you know, when I was teaching in secondary school, with the story about the knots and the kid, you know, when they didn't know that wood had come off of trees, I should say, that was when I realised the true value of reflection. And at that time, I thought I was a fantastic teacher, but I realised that I hadn't even been checking the basics, knowledge of understanding that the children in that case had. So what were they building on? Sand. You know, so that was when I realised that, you know, scholarship is something that I've obviously practiced it now for a very long time, but it's something that I do every day, and I do it to try and help improve and so that I can be the best that I am, whether I'm working with staff or students, you know. But yeah, that's the reflection.
There was a really interesting point about reading that Leonard made, and I think we've kind of alluded to that in the chat a little bit around. And also I raised something about PGCE-THEs as well, and whether they have a duty in encouraging SoTL as well. Yeah, I'm trying to figure out. Simon's got his hand up though, so he's probably going to respond to one of those things. So
I suppose I'm always really cognizant of the fact that if you're not naturally in a discipline where social science is your background, or you're not naturally aligned to that kind of approach, we also have to recognise that we don't need everybody to become experts in educational research to engage in scholarship. And I think sometimes we can kind of find ourselves in a position where people feel excluded from SoTL because we're using a language which is familiar to us and approaches, but actually they don't need to inherently know that language to the extent to which they know the language within their own discipline. I think we have to recognise and help colleagues to become familiar with SoTL as its concept, but also make sure they think they don't have to suddenly immerse themselves in really deep understanding of it as a research area, because it shouldn't feel like that to people. It's got to feel accessible to everyone, regardless of which discipline you're in.
Okay, just coming on that, the first real education-focused conference that I went to was the AHE conference in Manchester. And I was giving a presentation about my work. And I said, I'm not an educationalist. I come from a STEM background, but I want to be better. So I'd really value your critique of this and how do I make it better? And I had about 4 or 5 people come up to me after the talk and go, don't change. We need more people coming from a STEM discipline with a STEM focused approach of a hypothesis that you are testing coming into the educational space to give balance to that social science. So I think it's really important to recognise that, yes, we might not be trained educationalists, we might not be social scientists, but we still have an awful lot of value to add to that field just because of the training that we have had if you do come from different disciplines and applying that lens to SoTL. I think it's really important to highlight that.
I think we had Emily Nordman on a while back, didn't we? Was it a month ago, 2 months ago? October. So yeah, 2 months ago. And her great bit of advice around reading and things like that and stuff like that was she effectively said, just Google educational theory or educational theories and have a read of the definitions and find what resonates with you. And that's the lens almost that you can then take. It resonates with what you're doing. And I think that was really good advice. She said, then you can go deeper into that. So you don't necessarily, again, I think she was saying a lot of her stuff is rooted in psychology because she's a psychologist. So she used a lot of psychological theory in her educational research. So I think that just kind of resonates with what you were saying there, Nigel, about actually bringing those discipline specific things in can be really useful. Yeah, I just wanted to add that point.
I think we're probably going to start concluding the panel discussion because I'm mindful that people need to kind of finish on time. So I'm just going to jump to the end and going to ask, how do you see SoTL evolving over the next decade? I know Jackie's mentioned about a hit and rev, and hopefully that's the proper sector beginning of kind of acknowledging SoTL is a thing. But How do you see that evolving, or how would you like it to be evolving in the next decade or sooner?
So I've got a grand vision for how SoTL not takes over the world, but finds its place in an increasingly complex and consumerized higher education world. And I think it starts small. It's more people love it, enjoy it, get involved in it, are given permission to experiment and try and recognize that it's the doing and not the long-term impact so much that matters outside of your sphere of intention with your students. But we'll see more people collaborating across institutions and across disciplines. People will realise that they can get more bang for their buck and sort of generate more visibility and impact for their work if they partner up with, I don't know, somebody in politics from a different university who's got a similar issue in their classrooms. I think within institutions, I think senior leaders will have a light bulb moment and they'll suddenly realise scholarship is this activity that could solve all their woes around things like access and participation, awarding gaps, continuation problems, and student experience difficulties. But again, that will require collaboration, big thinking, financial support. So I see a bright future, and I think in 10 years' time, I really hope that we're in a really different place talking about the scholarship of teaching and learning, and it has a much stronger footing, certainly in the UK.
Yeah, we make a promise to each other. We'll come back in hopefully less than 10 years, but 10 years being the maximum. Come back and have the same panel and just exchange notes. Can we do that, please? That would make me really happy.
I'll be retired by then with a bit of luck.
Yeah.
But I'll come back.
Thank you.
I do feel like there's been this wave of, like, even the way that we've talked about teaching and learning, you know, in the last 15 years, you know, it was a really isolated and lonely thing to be someone who was really wanting to invest in their teaching and learning 15 years. And I think we are getting better as a community, and I think it's more junior academics, I think, are getting on board with this. I think there's more people have done good quality PG certs and whatever. So hopefully that you know, right, you know, that cohort becomes then the senior leaders who are then having that, you know, greater insight and whatever. And we're starting to see people kind of, you know, really get all the way up university tracks. So having really insightful approaches to teaching and learning, that the dominance of research only mentality, I think, is changing. So I'm hopefully, as that shift kind of goes through the layers, then that change starts to happen sort of more systemically.
Just to add to that, I think in the future, the ideal would be that a university sees scholarship as a core activity within the organisation, without question. But within that, you've also then got disciplinary level nuances around scholarship within the context of that discipline. And that's what I really like about the link that was shared for Shayla's work, which is specifically around STEM. Because I think we do need those nuanced conversations around scholarship in the context of biomedical sciences, scholarship in the context of STEM subjects, scholarship in whatever the discipline area is. It does need to have a nuanced perspective to it. Now, we know we can probably apply some broad kind of approaches to scholarship of teaching and learning, but I think the richest discussions always happen within that kind of localized disciplinary level, where you talk about what does scholarship mean in the context of this work that we do on a day-to-day basis within our discipline. A university that gets to that point in 10 years will be in a strong position to deliver really good student outcomes and experience.
I mean, just to echo what's been said, really, I mean, there's a lot of buzz around SoTL at the moment. I suspect that might be to do with the institutional preparations for TEF. But, you know, in 10 years' time or whatever, you know, I'd love it to be perceived as equal. And I think the other speakers who've mentioned about collaboration and the nuances between discipline and different types of research, I think, you know, so it's not seen as less than, it's seen as proper research. I have a feeling it'll depend upon how subsequent governments take the direction of things and how they will measure the outputs of higher education in the future. But I'm hopeful that there'll always be colleagues like us who absolutely love what we do. We want to make the difference for the very best for our students. So irrespective of what the political will at the time will be, we know what the value is of SoTL, we know its worth, and we'll always keep promoting that.
Absolutely. And I think just to conclude the panel properly, then just one bit of advice maybe from each of you, for someone who's wanting to start properly doing SoTL after this panel, because it's been inspirational. What advice have you got for people who are now inspired and they're ready to go?
Follow your heart, find your tribe. If you don't know where to start, go to your Centre for Learning and Teaching in your institution. You can find out about promotional pathways and things as well then, but have a look around, join a national network. There are quite a few now, the Scholarship Spotlight, and there's a new one based at Leeds. And I think you've got the other ones, you've got EuroSoTL, iSoTL. And I think anyone here today on the call would be happy to help if you can't find your tribe, and if your tribe doesn't exist, go and make it yourself. If you can't find something in your discipline that does what you want it to do, you'll be surprised how many people will join you.
But in the spirit of the name of this webinar, JFDI.
Well,
just flipping do it.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
A softer version of that would be just be a salmon. Right, don't be afraid to be a salmon, which is to swim against that tide and to know that it's the right thing to do. Because at the end of it, there's a spawning ground that you really want to create as a fertile space for learning and teaching. So don't be afraid to be a salmon.
And I think my piece of advice is don't do it alone. If you're starting out and it's your first piece of work in the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning, this privileging the individual is so damaging as a kind of component of how research cultures work. And in SoTL, it's such an open community of people who will work with you. So it might completely change the shape in part of what you were planning to do, but find someone who'll work with you, or find a couple of people who work with you, and give it a go, persist with it, and see what comes out of it. Be open-minded to it not being quite what you imagined at the beginning.
And also to say that salmon also spawn in groups, because obviously that's more success that way. So absolutely, be more salmon.
Simon, you don't want to know what images that are going through my mind.
I still prefer Nigel's definition.
So thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. And thank you once again for supporting us for another year. This panel brings the season 4 of the Terra Researchers and History Researchers to a close. We'll be back it's been a wonderful 4 years, and I really, really appreciate your help and your support, and all the speakers and our attendees, etc. Thank you very much, guys. Have a good weekend when it comes.